Get on home, yeah. Get on home,
Hello. This is episode 2, Are You Getting Fleeced? I am your host, God's gift to libertarian women, Dan Hill, and this is the Gold Kulak podcast. Now, first off, music credit will be in the show notes. I'm not quite for sure which opening song I'm going to use yet, but it is royalty-free so long as I'm non-commercial. But I'm still posting that link down there. Go check them out because it's going to be awesome. But you may have noticed a difference between the first and this podcast, and that is a name change. I decided to change the name since it was only like the second episode because there is a very, very right-winged, somewhat fascist group in Greece that they have a political party called Golden Dawn. And while I don't personally feel like that would cause a problem, I could see how my podcast could be linked to that, and I didn't really care for that idea because a lot of their values I don't hold, and I also just don't want people thinking I like fascist people. So there is that. Also, I had 13 subscribers. It fell down to 10. However, if you are listening and you are one of those early subscribers, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's only going to get better, I promise. So now into today's show. Is taxation theft? So are you getting fleeced? This is something that you will hear a lot about when you first get into libertarianism. And if you're a new libertarian, it is going to shock you, offend you, probably give you that knee-jerk reaction and go, nuh-uh. And I know this is because that's exactly how I reacted until I kind of dove into what it is. Now, normally, like articles and things that are going to try and convince you that taxation is theft is going to keep this towards the end of their paper or whatever, because after they've given you all these great reasons, then they kind of backtrack a little bit and say how it actually fits in reality. And since that phrase, taxation is theft, is such a knee-jerk reaction type thing, I'm just going to start off with this. And that is, taxation is theft does not necessarily mean that we want the end of all taxes. I mean, there were consumption taxes and tariffs basically from the beginning of the Constitution. A matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why we got the Constitution, was because the Articles of Confederation were so they were so inadequate for giving the central government power because they didn't want a strong central government. And in doing so, they essentially neutered the central government. So they had to redo that because the federal government was like, well, we have this power to raise an army, but how are we going to pay for this army? So it doesn't mean we want all taxes ever to be done. But what it does mean, and Michael Humer had an excellent article, I believe, on like the Mises.org, and it was to raise the standards of taxes. So, you know, there's cases that you could justify stealing. If there's some poor, you're out on a nice picnic with your family, beautiful picnic, as the president would say, and all of a sudden you notice a sandwich is missing, and you turn around and you look, and there's some like little dirty kid that like wearing shorts, but they used to be pants. You can tell they're just all torn and frayed, and like his shirt's in tatters. You probably don't call the cops because he stole your sandwich. You probably think he needs it more than I do, and that's kind of how the government should be. Like, there's some essential services we need to pay for. We need a military. We need courts. There's some things I think we need that maybe other libertarians don't, and vice versa. So at some point, the government does need to be able to raise money. Matter of fact, like one of the king, like anarcho-capitalists, Murray Rothbard, basically said that when you're trying to pay for a war, that taxes were the most moral, because for two reasons. First, the the population knows exactly how much you're spending on the war. And the second reason is because once it's over, there's no debt. You raised your money. So then why, if you say taxes are okay, why would you say it's theft if you're still okay with some taxes? My first and foremost, and it's a point that Murray Rothbard actually brings up, and it's just people can't agree on who is hurt the most by taxes. For example, some people are going to say, particularly the rich, the taxes molt the rich on behalf of the poor. It's a analogy to a goose, or a metaphor to a goose. The middle class is exploiting the poor and the rich. So basically, the middle class might be paying in less of a percentage of their income versus the rich and the poor, and so they're getting all these extra benefits, maybe. And the last one is the rich are exploiting the poor. We're essentially creating this corporate welfare type deal where these poor people are having to pay taxes and do all this work while the rich are getting tax breaks and government inside deals and all this stuff. And at the end of the day, and what Rothbard was arguing is you're creating these unfair brackets of taxpayers. Like, it isn't a real thing that you're doing. You're just creating this false sense of classes by who you want to argue about is being hurt the most by taxes. And I get that might not explain why taxation is theft very well, or at all, just mainly highlights how unfair they can be. But here is an analogy that's pretty popular. So if I walked up to you and I pointed a gun in your face and I said, give me $300, and you did that, and then I went out and I gave that $300 to the local soup kitchen, maybe some sort of like a child representative charity, and the American Cancer Society, split up 100, whatever. You could still press charges on me. We would all agree that is still stealing. And the reason is I used force against you, and that's part of libertarianism that I'm still getting into, is the non-aggression policy or principle. So just because the government is doing that to you doesn't make it right. Second, somebody might say, well, you're required to pay taxes because you entered into a social contract. But when exactly did I sign this social contract? Well, you were born into it. Okay, so I'm being forced to pay for stuff regardless whether I use it or not. And I'm bound by this contract I never explicitly signed or agreed to. And I'm born into it. You know who else was born into something, into a contract that was inescapable for them, and they were bound to it regardless of their consent? It was slaves. So essentially, the more we allow a country or government to tax us, essentially enslaves us to that government. And I don't think that's too big of a stretch. And I know it sounds that way, but the more you're willing to give up to a government, the more the government owns you. And that is not the basic tenet, the basic principles on what America is founded on. And I'm kind of getting off topic. But essentially another argument may be the government can define property rights. So they get to say whether what's right or what's not. And I disagree with that. And once again, going back to Michael Humer's piece on it, there's certain inalienable rights that you have. They're natural human rights. And for example, if, let's say, you go out into international waters, You land on an island that's unclaimed by anyone. It's just this island. It's not even on maps. But you find some lone survivor castaway guy on it, just an old hermit. And he's lived there for years, makes these beautiful spears. He finds ivory washes up on the shores, and he crafts these intricate spearheads, and he uses this beautiful driftwood beam for the shaft of the spear, and he waxes it with palm oil and ties in the tropical feathers from birds on that island. Just these gorgeous, gorgeous spears. And before you leave, you take one of his spears and you leave. Now, I think nearly all of us would agree that would be stealing. You can't just take another's property without their consent. And even on this island out in the middle of nowhere with this old hermit, you would both, I think, realize the morality. If you were caught taking that and hauling it back to your boat, I think most of us would realize that, yeah, I shouldn't have done this, as well as the hermit would probably be mad that you took something he worked for. So either A, you're going to have to live with the fact that your personal income, which essentially means the hours that you're trading to earn that, is owned by the government. So essentially you're owned by the government, and that is not even a Lockean ideal. The Lockean ideal is that governments get their power from the consent of the governed, not the other way around. And I think the biggest point I'd like to drive home is that taxes aren't voluntary. In the beginning, all of America's taxes were either a tariff, so the people not even in America were being taxed and used to pay for the government. And that's something that I personally don't support anymore. I think we should reduce and get rid of most tariffs because, and this is going way too far down an economics route for what this podcast should be, or what this specific episode should be about. But essentially, the more money, the more American dollars other countries have by not taxing their imports, or exports, however you want to put it, by our imports, that's the more American dollars they have to buy our exports. So tariffs aren't necessarily good. The other thing was there was a consumption tax. They would tax certain goods. So you would pay your sin tax for alcohol, and you could choose, if I don't want to drink, I don't have to pay this tax. And so we didn't even have a federal income tax until the 16th Amendment passed, and I forgot to write down the year for sure. I believe it was 1913, and it was never supposed to be more than 3%. And originally, it was only the top 3% that had to pay for it. And now we end up with this massive tax code that you have to go to school for years and pass multiple exams to be able to even do someone's taxes. It's 72,000 pages long, getting longer by the year. We have a retirement program, essentially, the Social Security, which is welfare, and it's a scam. It's a Ponzi scheme. Initially, it was, I believe, 5 or 6 people, somebody fact-checked me, to one retiree. And this was done in a time where life expectancy was 61. And Social Security didn't start paying out till you were 65. So the average person didn't live long enough to even get paid by that. And it was only supposed to be a short-term thing. And at the best, you're only getting cents to the dollar that you're paying. I have 75 cents to a dollar that you're paying in. I've seen other figures. And so I know some of this is kind of theoretical. Some of it might not be super convincing. Maybe because at this point in my career, I might not be the best communicator of this. But it's one thing that I do want to bring up because I think it's a powerful point. I think it's a very powerful point. And I think it's that we're desensitized to taxes. Your taxes, I think since World War II, have been pulled out of your paychecks before you can actually see or use the money. We have the withholding. So even though you might be making $3,000 a year, your check for $2,100, that's what you budget for. You're not budgeting for your gross pay, you're budgeting for your net pay. And so you never actually get to see how you would have spent that extra percentage of money. And I added it up. That is, I paid $8,400 on my town job, on top of what I had to pay for my farm, which hurt. But anyways, what do you think would be more transformative in a person's life that is struggling to get by? Do you think that potential scenarios where they actually don't get the amount of benefits from SNAP or WIC or whatever government program they're on, they don't actually get the amount of benefits back that they pay in taxes? Or do you think it would be more transformative if instead of having to pay $900 in taxes, just roughing it out right here, instead of paying that $900 in taxes every month, they instead were paying $450, and all of a sudden, not having to pay taxes covered, depending on where you are, either all your rent to half your rent. Is that not more transformative to getting food stamps? That even though maybe you're getting $190 in food stamps every month, you have to spend those on food. You can't use those to invest in job training or a nice shirt so you can go to a job interview. So that's what I want to come around to, and that's what I want to end this podcast on, is first off, I want to reiterate, taxation is theft. Does not mean that we're against all taxes. It's just that taxes should be held to a higher standard. If you wouldn't be able to justify somebody stealing for that, then we shouldn't be taxed for it. The second thing is, the only reason why you're paying taxes is because you have no other choice. You are being forced. If you're being forced to pay something, it's theft. Because even though the tax collector might smile at you and give you some phone calls, which they're not supposed to do not pay those. I almost fell for that once. Anyways, even though it's the government that's holding the gun, or even though it's the government who's not holding a literal gun to your head versus some mugger in the street with a literal gun, there's still force behind the government, because if you don't pay, you can end up in prison. Not jail, prison, serving sentences of multiple years. So I think that's where I'm going to trail off on. I hope I explained my position, the libertarian position, a little bit better on what taxation as theft means. And if you have any extra questions, you can try to get a hold of me. I don't have a show Twitter account set up yet, but you can go to goldkulak.podbean.com, and using Facebook, you can comment on the show episode. So that's goldkulak.podbean.com. Also, if you're still listening and wondering what the heck a kulak is, basically they were a peasant class from Russia that were actually able to save up enough money, buy their own property, and start farming. And after the Bolshevik Revolution, they weren't really on the communist good side because they supported the czars. And when they found out that they're going to have to give all of their crops up to the government, basically because the government was going to collect all their crops and redistribute them, they were harshly punished and killed and starved and all that good stuff. So, and it eventually evolved into basically a slur in Russia or the Soviet Russia was to call someone a kulak. So I thought that was good for the show and what its purpose is, which might not necessarily be to convince someone you need to be libertarian or conservative even, but that there's certain things about communism and socialism that you shouldn't stand for. So even if you're a Democrat and you support some of the democratic stuff, you shouldn't support all of it. Because I can tell you that I have the hardest time trying to narrow down my politics to a single party. I finally settled on the libertarian one because it fit my morals the best. So, yeah, that's what this podcast is about. And I am rambling, so I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are still listening, you are the best. A new episode will drop next Tuesday. Not quite for sure on what yet. I'll let you know. Thanks again and have a great rest of your week.
Yeah.